Mario J. Calentino from St. Louis.
Where are you originally from?
Springfield, Illinois. That's the point where I went into the service.
Tell me, why did you join the service?
I had messed up my life at that point and decided I had to change it. And in order for me to do so, I had to get my year out of the way. And I joined up in the horse cavalry to get my year out of the way.
Explain to me what you mean by year out of the way.
There was a draft then, and everyone had to serve 1 year in the service. This was back in 1941, before the war started. And I knew that I was in the early draft, and as I say, I wanted to get my year out of the way, and so I joined up and was put in the horse cavalry. When the war started, I said, well, this is for real, and I transferred into the Air Corps.
There was no problem with transferring?
Yes, there was quite a problem. They wouldn't release me out of the horse cavalry, and the only way I could be released is by taking the examination to become an aviation cadet. And so that's the reason I took that aviation cadet training program, is because it was the only way to get out of the cavalry. I was in the medical corps, and who wanted to be in the medical corps during the war?
Tell me, what was your position when you finally joined the 385th? What was your position?
I was a second lieutenant and a co-pilot on Alexander's ragtime band.
How many missions did you fly?
I flew 30.
Tell me about your crew. Who was on your crew?
We were somewhat different as we progressed. They broke us up. I became a first pilot. Our navigator was taken away, and he became a lead navigator using the new radar equipment. And at that time, bombing through clouds was becoming a thing, and he became a navigator that could read the ground through this radar equipment. And several of the other fellows were busted out and sent to other groups because we were experienced and they wanted to intersperse us with others. And as I say, they gave me they checked me out as a first pilot in about the 16th to 17th mission, and we broke up. But up until that time, we were a unit.
Are anybody still living at this time?
Very few of us. The pilot is gone. The navigator is gone. The bombardier is gone. Tail gunner is gone. Waist gunner is gone. I finally located the radio man, found him in New York just about 3 months ago. And the ball turret man is living in Washington. He's retired. He was in the printing business for the government, I believe. And the others I can't find.
Okay. Tell me your first combat experience, please.
Scary.
Well, tell me about it, please.
Actually, the first one was really, for me, was an easy one. It was a sort of a milk run, and we crossed the channel, went into Belgium, maybe a couple 100-mile, drop our bomb, and came back out again. Those weren't the early ones. Really, they broke us in with a couple of easy ones. And then came the harrowing ones.
Well, tell me about the harrowing ones.
Well, probably the most difficult one was into Brunswick. It's about our third or fourth, maybe fifth mission. And we were going into Brunswick. We were supposed to go 3 wings were supposed to go in, but the other 2 couldn't make it because of weather conditions. And we went in alone, and we were not escorted back in those days. And the fighters picked us up the moment we crossed the channel, and they worked us over all the way into the target. They tried to stop us, but they couldn't, and they worked us all the way back, and we had a 30% loss on that trip, which was unusual. And Archie was with us.
Tell me a little bit more about it, that mission.
Well, it was one that you really don't want to think about too much, but planes would pull over and people would bail out, other planes would pull over and some would bail out and they'd blow up. It was a difficult thing. Probably the worst one I was on throughout the whole tour. We had others nearly as bad, but not that bad.
Tell me a story, or tell me an experience that you may have told 1,000 times. And when you tell it, people will get around and says, Mario, don't tell me that story again.
Well, this was a great one. We were as a unit, a crew, and we went down to London. Shall I go on?
Please. And probably stopped at the Windmill Club.
No, I'm pulling your leg, but we would go to diverse a little bit, and to roll it back a little bit. You know, it's amazing when the crews are put together, we don't know each other at all. And each has our own circle of friends, and we stick with that own circle of friends. And it's a while before we'll melt into a unit. And I'd like to lead up to where we melted into a unit. We're in Pyote, Texas, and I would go with my friends, and the pilot would go with his friends, and the navigator would go with his friends, and the enlisted men would go with their friends. And that was that way through first, second, and third phasing. And then after we got through the 3 phases, we only were a unit in the airplane when we went up. When we got down on the ground, we went our own separate ways. And we were a rather efficient crew, and I think the top 10% of our group got to fly their own airplanes over, and we were in the top 10%. So we went to Grand Island, Nebraska. We got our airplanes. The others got whatever thing they got, and they went over in the Queen Mary. And they beat us over. We flying over, and I'll tell you the story when we gelled. We got into this craft, and we could only get clearance through to Detroit, Michigan. And we were weathered in there for 10 days. And believe it or not, in that 10-day period, we became a crew. Because we relied on one another, we stuck with one another, and we were weathering again at Gander, Newfoundland, and then we flew the Atlantic, and from that on, we didn't go with our friends. Our friends were our crew members, and every 10 days, I think it was, we would get 3-day pass, and we would go as a unit down to London, and as a unit we'd all check in the same hotel, and as a unit we'd go our separate ways, but we always came back for boozing and sitting around and talking and lying to one another. But we became a crew in Detroit, Michigan on the way over, and not until then. So that's how we gelled. And we gelled, even though we were not good buddies with one another, we were a good crew. As I say, we ranked in the top 10%.
Tell me, how do you know these women?
Well, I fell in love with them when I first met them. Where was it? First time I met you, was it
Okay, did you go to Las Vegas?
No, I didn't go to Las Vegas.
Okay, it was in Spokane.
Spokane is, matter of fact, we stopped, you're living in just south of Missoula.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife and I, on our way to Spokane, we flew into Salt Lake City, rented a car, and just meandered around the Northwest because we had not been in that part of the country, and we loved Montana. We went to various places. And we talked to Archie on the telephone when we was at your house. And we saw them all in Spokane.
But we know many stories about him.
Oh.
We knew exactly who he was.
Yep. Knew his name for you.
And I know who they were too.
I would like you to, I'm going to ask you 2 more last questions. Name me one man that stands out most in your mind with the 385th and why.
The one man in the 385th?
That's right.
Oh, it has to be Van Devener.
Why?
When you looked up at the board in the briefing room and you saw he was leading, you knew you were in for a tough one because he didn't take the easy ones. And I have to tell you another story. First of all, and secondly, he was a leader. Even though he was 1 year older than I, he was a leader. And I've got to tell you this story. I had completed my tour, and they had offered me a number of jobs because they wouldn't send us home back in the days. the war, the invasion had just started, and they say the traffic back was pretty thick. But at any rate, they wouldn't send me back, and they offered me a number of jobs. And I looked the jobs over, and I didn't particularly care for anyone because I didn't think it was suited for a pilot to go into that type of work. So I volunteered for a second tour, thinking that all of us would have to be a second tour. And I was walking down the street one day, and Colonel Van Dieven was driving, well, he wasn't driving, his chauffeur was driving up the road. He pulled the car over, he called me over to his car, and here I am, a first lieutenant, and he called me over and he says, Lieutenant, I understand you volunteered for another tour. And that impressed me. And I says, yes, sir. He says, why? And I told him. He says, if I can get you home, would you still volunteer for a second tour? And I says, no, sir. He had me home in 2 weeks. They flew me home. Now, wasn't that great? That's why I think he's a great man.
Well, the last question is, what does it mean to you to be part of the 385th?
If I can just keep them choking up. I've accomplished a lot. I've become a vice president with one company. I became a senior vice president with another company. But I feel in this part of life that my greatest achievement was when I was with the 385th. I think that was the high point of my life.
Any other thing you'd like to add?
These two young ladies had a great father, I'll have to tell you that. He showed leadership qualities, even when he was the tail gunner overseas. And he was a gelling force. He certainly was a gelling force with the enlisted men. And he was a gelling force with us as well. And then, of course, after the formation of this organization, there's no question in my mind that he became the most popular man in this organization. And he still is very, very fondly thought of. I think a great deal of Archie.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.